So, again, welcome to the history class. We're glad to share this experience with you, community members, students. Class begins. Back to school, week number 2. Community members, we're talking to you guys as well. Sit up, pay attention, take notes. No, not at all. If you've got a name placard in front of you, you better be paying attention, taking notes. It's a collaboration. This museum, the Silverside Submarine Museum, has been working together with Muskegon Community College for several years to bring forth educational programs. Last week in week 1, we talked about the drum beats of war. We walked the way up from 1850 to 1860, understanding that a war that divided our nation did not happen casually, and there were certainly many, many precursors, and we looked at those. Today we're going to take an examination of Civil War armies. On your chair you received a couple handouts, and those handouts were the order of battle. It gave you the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the Confederate Army. And what these armies did, it gave you the commanders, the corps, regiments, officers, and all of this we're going to walk through today. Students, you didn't receive this page because it's hiding. Nicholas, where would this page be hiding? On Blackboard. We've got an online site, so it's your responsibility, students. You demand that your professors put all this information online for you, and thus we demand that you find it. So it's there waiting for you. We've got 2 armies. The Army of Northern Virginia, commanded by the infamous Robert E. Lee, and the Army of the Potomac, sort of commanded by General George Meade. And I say sort of because he got his promotion 72 hours before the battle. Yeah, so he was relatively new in command. We need to understand what officers were and what their ranks were. We've got 3 levels of officers at this time and still relatively unchanged today. We look at our lowest officers. These are called line officers. Your second, first lieutenant, and your captains. They're going to be managing a line, a very small number of people, and they've got specific duties involved with their unit. Senior officers over them. Again, a huge jump from your junior to senior officers with your major lieutenant colonels and colonels. And they're going to be in charge of an area. They're field officers. They'll have command over an area. And you'll see this in the handouts. And one of the many, many challenges the South faced throughout the second half of the war was the depletion of their officer ranks. General officers. At this time, general officers were 1 through 5 stars. We still recognize that system today, slightly different. So your general officers, you're going to see brigadier generals, major generals, lieutenant generals. I would love to be a general. And then a general of the Army. The Confederacy would be slightly different. Not significantly, but slightly different. So when you do your research, you'll find slight differences. But understand the difference between junior officers, senior officers, and general officers. And that's laid out in the handout that I gave you. These are our commanders for the upcoming battle at Gettysburg. The infamous Robert E. Lee, and he was legendary before the war started. He truly was. And George Meade. Meade was promoted, as we said, 72 hours prior to the start of this campaign. We look at their backgrounds. George Meade, his nickname, Old Snappin' Turtle. I guess that face, I don't know, maybe that's a snapping turtle face. Old Snapping Turtle. We look at his background. Like so many of these officers, he was a young lieutenant during the Mexican-American War, serving under General Scott and Captain Robert E. Lee. He's got a Michigan tie. He was a surveyor, and thus Meade was up in the Traverse City area surveying the bay in 1858 prior to the war. Meade distinguished himself from the beginning, and in many ways, while he had a fine career, he was not Lincoln's first choice. He was not Lincoln's first choice. But Often we fight not with the army we want, but the army that we have. And we'll learn more about General Hooker and who he was and why he was replaced. George Maniates will talk to us a little about him. Robert E. Lee. Again, this was a man that was legendary prior to the war. Married into the George Washington family. His father, Harry Lighthorse Lee, was one of the generals of the Revolutionary War and really one of Washington's contemporaries and his peers, and one of Washington's biggest critics. Lighthorse Harry Lee, we'll say, was a character of perhaps ill repute. And in many ways, that's what led Robert E. Lee to have the stoic, absolute character that defines West Point even today. Allegedly the only person to go through West Point with 2 demerits in his entire career. And we'll learn more about West Point actually in the winter when we get to our World War II series. We're going to have Colonel Ron Janowski speaking to us about West Point. He was in charge of virtually all of the officers on both sides in 2 different ways. One, he led most all of the officers on both sides in the Mexican-American War. And then the juniorest officers who were too young to fight in that war, they were not yet in officer school. Well, after the Mexican-American War, Robert E. Lee was the commandant at West Point. So of the roughly 300 officers on the Union side at the start of the war, probably 250 had a direct relationship with Robert E. Lee. We look at the Gettysburg Theater, and we'll learn all about this battle next week when we've got these wonderful guides from Gettysburg Skyping in with us and giving us the battle. We've got a lot of people here. Again, approximately 175,000 troops would converge on the small town of Gettysburg. And remember, for every troop, you're probably bringing about a half of an animal. So the point being, an army of 40,000, or excuse me, of 80,000 might have 40,000 mules and horses and oxen. You got a lot of feet trampling out of the city of Gettysburg. How to read a battlefield. And this is important. This will help us reading our books, help us when we walk the battlefield in a what is an army? What's a division? What's a corps? And these are approximate numbers, particularly by the time Gettysburg arrives. It's right about the midway of the and virtually all of these are going to be at about 60 to 75% strength. And by the end of the war, these numbers will reduce well under half. But the key is looking at that handout. Microphones work or not, and sometimes it could not be the opposite whatsoever. But more importantly, how to read these battlefields. We look at what is an army. And the Union Army would be divided into corps, as would the Confederate Army, and the size of the corps tells you much about the strength, and we'll see how the Union troops just really overwhelmed the Confederates before, during, and particularly after Gettysburg. Confederates would be led by lieutenant generals at the armies, as well as major generals in the North. So there's some differences here, probably not something to get too bogged down with, but it is confusing when you read different levels of generals and what they were doing. And that's why we put these notes all online, print them off, and you can certainly refer back to them. What's a corps? What's a cavalry? What's their purpose? And we can see the Union Army is divided into 12 different corps, as were the Confederate Army 3 different corps. And Lee just had a different strategy of flexibility and command and control. So he gave tremendous command and control to his overall Army commanders, which would be the infamous General Longstreet, and right up until this battle, Stonewall Jackson. And that was really one of the turning points of this battle, was losing Stonewall Jackson a mere month before Gettysburg. What are components of an army? Well, we look at components of the Army in the Civil War. They had 3 different primary components, and they all did different things. You had mounted soldiers. Their job was to seek out and find the enemy. And as you're learning, reading through Killer Angels, General Stuart was nowhere to be found. He was out surrounding the Union Army. Part of it was reconnaissance. A big part was a bit of ego and he was out of place, we'll put it that way. He should have been much closer because the cavalry was the eyes and the ears of the commander. You had the cannoneers, and the purpose of a cannoneer was to soften them up. We'll see these cannons at Gettysburg and how accurate they were firing 2 miles away. Really very accurate. The type of canister and shot that they were firing, just absolute devastating. And then, of course, army. So you've got 3 different sections: infantry, cavalry, and cannoneers, and they all have a different purpose at this time. Was there an Air Force during the Civil War? Don't be so sure. A very young man named General George Custer, who is not a general quite yet, was up in hot air balloons. He was up in hot air balloons as early as 1861. So it didn't pan out, obviously, for this war, but in many ways that was the preliminary to our Air Force. Command and control. You got to understand that civilian command and control. While the generals are making decisions on the ground, both sides fully understood that it was the president at home that had the ultimate decision. So commander in charge of this, and our president and the Confederacy modeled their short-lived Constitution very much after the U.S. Constitution. So they very much empowered their president, Jefferson Davis, with similar traits. The idea of being in charge of the national armies, but also all of the militias and National Guards. They were not combined into a fighting force the way they are today. Constitutional divisions. And often we look at the president as having far too much authority because Congress funds the army, Congress raises an army, and while the president is commander-in-chief, they're really not laying out the day-to-day strategy. But ultimately, here, and the buck would stop with President Jefferson Davis and this relatively new guy, Abraham Lincoln. And we say this new because when we examine their backgrounds, I think we'll find he did not have the same background that did. For Jefferson Davis, he was a former Secretary of War. He was an officer in the Mexican-American War. He was a senator in the United States. He had tremendous experience in command. Abraham Lincoln, yes, he was a captain in the Black Hawk War, did not see combat service, which of course was very much a defining moment for veterans at this time. He was against the Mexican-American War. He spoke out against that war. Got a commander on one side with all the credentials, and a commander on the other with very thin credentials. Perseverance. Jefferson, through his many faults, would stick with his commanders. He'd known Robert E. Lee for the better part of 20 years before the war, and he would stick with Lee. He served with Lee in Mexico, and he would stick with Lee as an advisor and as commanding general. Lincoln, on the other hand, we're so quick to praise Lincoln as the greatest president winning the war. Well, there's a lot of room for criticism. This man went through 9 different commanders. 9 different commanders. And we look at General McClellan as twice. Twice he was promoted and fired. And then McClellan would turn around and run against Lincoln in the 1864 election. So Lincoln, with all of his traits, indecisive, unable to manage his generals. We look at them in retrospect. Jefferson Davis certainly had his faults, and probably the biggest fault, and it's so easy to assess 200 or 150 years later, he was obsessed with controlling the capital city of Richmond, a mere 100 miles away from Washington, D.C., and he devoted far too much time and energy and resources. Robert E. Lee disagreed with him. Lee was ready to trade capitals. He had no trouble with that. As were Lincoln, again, his biggest problem with Abraham Lincoln is he could not settle, support, and promote his commanders, which I think is to be understood. We cannot put anyone up as a deity. We cannot look at anyone without fault. And Lincoln, when you scratch the surface, was clearly a man with fault. So now we're ready to take the walk from Lincoln's election right up to the eve of Gettysburg. So Professor George Maniates is going to walk us through that in the next hour plus and really bring us into the eve of the Gettysburg battle.
Thanks. Before I get started, I'm going to pull up our slide set here. Obviously, it's hard to do a complete walkthrough of 2+ years of the war in an hour, but we're going to try to do that in the best possible fashion. And I can't unfortunately get into every blow in every battle. So if I don't do a battle justice and you think that you might want to hear a little more, that's always at the end Q&A that we can do with you. So please beware of that. But we're going to look at the first 2 years of the war, and I think what we need to understand is before President Lincoln assumes office, the tensions are already rising. We have a problem because in December of 1860, South Carolina has already seceded from the Union. They're not waiting for Lincoln. They already knew his reputation, quote unquote. Well, they hadn't. How could they have known anybody's reputation? They're already leaving. So they've left. And Lincoln is being scrutinized by all the states in the South, not just because of the issue of slavery, but many of the issues we discussed last week. The economic, the political, the social issues are so great that this is really causing attention. The South is looking. And part of the problem we will see tonight is there's a series of challenges being laid down between the South and the new president. Let's explore his boundaries. And where are those boundaries going to come to a head? Fort Sumter. Early as February and early March, attempts to bring supplies to Fort Sumter were intercepted by Confederate ships which turned around the Union vessels, or the United States vessels, and the supplies weren't coming through. Correspondence between the commander of Fort Sumter and the White House indicated that they were coming close on their rations. They were worried. No supplies, how are we going to survive out here? Lincoln is playing a game of chicken. We'll keep sending ships. Let's see what happens. Well, as we know, that gentleman up there, General Pierre Gustave Toussaint Beauregard. That's a heck of a name, huh? Fresh from Louisiana. West Point educated. Fine soldier. He has been commissioned by the new Confederacy to scrutinize the situation. On April 12th, 1861, they're going to test the resolve of that fort. They opened fire. First shot was fired by a firebrand, somebody who was so vehemently pro-slavery, he had the honor of setting the fuse to fire the first cannon. You know, this is kind of a big thing. How are those Union boys, those Northern boys, going to react? Are they going to surrender? Are they going to fight? Well, clearly, after bombardment of most of a day, the forces inside the fort ran the colors. They surrendered. No casualties. No deaths. When they're taking down the flag, the U.S. flag, striking the colors, it was customary to fire off a cannon. The cannon backfired, blew up, killed somebody. That was the only casualty. First casualty of the war was not caused by combat, but was caused by a ceremony. Okay, so we got that going. But I want you to understand the magnitude of this war, because I think this is what makes the Civil War what it is, folks. Why do we continue to study it? Why are there hundreds of books published on it? 10,500 battles fought in 23 different states over the course of the war. As far north as Minnesota, far west as New Mexico, as far south as Florida. We have a combination of naval engagements, land engagements. We see the development of the Ironsides, which we'll talk briefly about today, the first metal-clad ships that will be spawning a new navy. We're going to be talking about portraits of leadership. We're going to also be talking about portraits of disgrace. People that will be infamous, that we'll know about when we hear their names. And some of them you'll laugh at, others you'll be troubled by. So as we go forward, keep that in mind. But this battle, 650,000 casualties. This is perhaps one of the most bloodiest engagements ever to be fought by Americans. Remember, Americans are fighting who? America. This is brother versus brother, family versus family. This is a tragic situation. And let me humbly suggest that this war has also caused and will be the foundation for relations within the country for better than 100 plus years. We can talk about things that emerged post-Reconstruction. Well, you can look at it and say, well, that started right back after the Civil War finished. All of these things continued on. Segregation, the whole issue of civil rights, the economic disparities, well, they all can be traced to the Civil War. Well, to give you a notion, we need to talk about killed in action, which means actually fighting, versus casualties that were caused while you were in the Army. And I think you get a flavor that you are more likely to die in camps or hanging out with the Army because of the poor sanitation, the poor living conditions, disease, and other things than you were to die by being killed in battle. Now, don't let me dismiss being killed in battle or wounded in battle, because it was equally as bad. Please remember that surgery at this point in time it's a joke. It's like a butcher shop. If you were shot in the arm or the leg, most of the time that meant that your arm or leg was amputated. If you were shot in the torso, they would evaluate. Some cases they would try to save you. Other cases you were triaged out, left under a tree, and hopefully you passed with minimum pain. But look at those numbers. Sad numbers. Well, Kurt had alluded to the fact that we are pitting two minds. Lincoln versus Davis. And their perspectives of battle are going to be much different. Lincoln, because of his lack of experience, is not going to understand fully how wars are fought. And he's going to clash sometimes with the generals. He's going to be angered when they don't follow up. And heck, he fires more generals for not chasing Lee. At least 2 or 3 of his major generals are fired, demoted, because they didn't chase Lee after a battle. Well, if you never have fought a battle, you might not understand what has occurred to your army. And maybe that's not appropriate to follow up. Whereas Davis is infatuated with, as Kurt is talking about, hanging on to this capital. And yet we will see by the third year of the war, he's lost his own hometown. And pretty much, if we really want to say, by the third year of the war is over for the South, because the South is torn asunder. It's cut in two. And it's going to be very difficult to win. Now, what is the conditions of victory? Well, the simple objectives, these are the objectives for the North. Well, first of all, you got to blockade the southern ports. You cannot allow resupply of munitions, of food, of material to come from Europe. Remember that the leading trading partner of this time is England. England wants every bale of cotton that they possibly can get from the South. Those bales of cotton are fueling their textile industry. And in return, the South would love every barrel of ammunition, every weapon, every uniform they could lay hands on. So the first thing is take the advantage of the Northern Navy, because most of the shipyards are located in what part of the country? The Northeast. And take the Northern Navy, which is one of their strategic advantages, and block up the ports. And the ports that need to be blocked, you got Norfolk, you have Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, and eventually plug up New Orleans. Because if you plug those up, what's going to happen? The South won't be resupplied, and you'll be able to start shortening the war. And we allude to that, and I'll show you the next slide. It's called the anaconda effect. The other thing is to defeat the Southern forces as rapidly as you can. Hopefully that you have better personnel, you have better materials, that you can do this. But as we're seeing from the onset of the war, that's not the case, right? The better officers are going with who? Confederacy. So we have a vacuum there. The other thing is to split the Confederacy right down the middle along the Mississippi River. Separate the western portions of the Confederacy, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, separate them for the rest of the Confederacy, and then you can start dealing with a diminished Confederacy. You have to remember that much of the agricultural land of the Southeast is used for what? Cotton. Well, if you need your pork and you need your beans, you're looking for the western part of the Confederacy to have that. By separating the two, you can do that. The other thing is seize the capital. Obviously, if you take the other guy's capital, one assumes that you're going to have a tactical victory. Well, these strategies were overly ambitious, obviously. And they're not going to be easily executed, and we'll see that as we go through this tonight. Here's the anaconda effect. This was Winfield Scott, General Winfield Scott's approach. Now remember, General Winfield Scott, and I'll show you his picture in a second, 71 years old, 360 pounds, has dropsy, gout, doesn't breathe well, probably had sleep apnea, not sleeping very well, can't ride a horse. He's the major in charge, major general in charge. 1861, he's got to find his replacement. Of course, he approached who? Robert E. Lee, and Robert E. Lee begged him not to appoint him, just leave him alone, let him sit out. And Winfield Scott said, I can't have an equivocator. I need somebody to make a decision. Either you're the man or not. And because he forced himself so much, the story is Lee then went and signed up to represent his state of what? Virginia. He wasn't going to be passive. He was going to take a side now. Now, just to give you a flavor here, the area that we're looking here in the South, in terms of land mass, much bigger, isn't it? From east to west with the Confederacy. But as we know, as we get out further to the west, the number of people living out here is what? Sparse. Whereas if you're going to the Midwest, we're seeing now a new dynamic commercial center focused on the Great Lakes, a growing concern. And that will continue to grow throughout the Civil War because we'll see more and more industry focusing there, okay? So keep that in mind. As the South will be devastated because most of the fighting is going to occur on the territory of the Confederacy, less fighting goes on in the North. The North is getting a pass. They can continue to manufacture, to build, etc. And as we see, most of the battles will be focused on the South. Now, when we look at the Civil War, we need to really divide it into three different theaters, and I'll back off on the map. The Eastern Theater would be this segment along the eastern seaboard of the Confederacy, essentially from Virginia all the way through Georgia. That would be the Eastern Theater, okay? The Western Theater would focus upon this area, including the Midwest, the Mississippi Valley, and the area going out towards Texas. Now, we will also see the Gulf of Mexico and the area around the Mississippi Delta treated as the third theater of operations. Why is that so critical? Because the South and its lack of railroads is going to be heavily dependent upon rivers, boats, steamboats, etc., getting that stuff downriver to supply its cities and other areas, to move around its products. If you can stop and cut the river off, the South will have problems being able to supply itself. The Union realizes that very early on. And when we talk about the Western Theater, we're going to focus on operations along the Mississippi River, the Cumberland River, and the Tennessee Rivers, because those three rivers are going to be pivotal in terms of Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, Kansas. And remember that Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland are not in the Confederacy. They're slave states that are hanging, not in the Union, not in the Confederacy, kind of on the sidelines. Battles are going on there. There's significant sympathies with the South, but they cannot join because Lincoln has significant forces there to keep them out of the Confederacy's hands. Border states. Well, hostilities break out. The size of the Northern Army, the Union Army, 1861 April, is 16,000 men. Well, that's not very many men for an army. So where do you get soldiers? Well, they encouraged enlistments. Come join. Well, of course, everybody wants in. This is going to be a short war. And war in the 1860s as well as the 1800s, it was glorious to fight, wasn't it? It was like a sign of manhood. Go fight. War was viewed as a rite of passage. Today, I don't think we encourage young men to go fight as a rite of passage, do we? I think we're kind of wiser that combat today is not necessarily a glorious or romantic type of thing. But at that time, it is. It's viewed as a romantic thing. Well, the recruiting poster on the right, excursion to the southern, sunny South. You know which state is running that particular ad? State of Michigan. You could sign up right down in Battle Creek. They're forming 3 regiments. Your choice of regiments. Well, you know what they're paying to sign up to fight? $12 a month. It's not too bad, is it? If I'm a newly arrived immigrant or I'm a farmer, $12 a month, those aren't bad wages, are they? And a lot of initial surge comes with people saying, well, this is a great alternative. Maybe I won't have to fight. Maybe the war will be over, I'll make a buck. Well, we know that isn't going to be true, because these people are signed up for 90-day enlistments. Some of the advantages, well, you get 3 cots, you get to sleep on the ground, but you're with a lot of guys. Good camaraderie. Might be like a good camping trip, huh? Yeah. I don't think so. These are the accommodations. This is your typical train. Take a look here. Do you see what I see? There's the tents. There is the wagons. Where do you see? What other things do you see? Is there any basic sanitation things? Maybe, and you probably don't see it, there's a pit where everybody was relieving themselves. Well, I would venture to say close by there must have been a well that they were drawing their what from? Wonder why people were getting sick, eh? They just didn't have the common sense of understanding the pathology of how disease operates. Here is our initial leaders here. Winfield Scott to the left. Obviously not a very healthy specimen at age 71. Not ready for the battle. Moves on, he's going to select McDowell, General McDowell, to lead the army. It's not the first choice, but he's their best choice. Well, you've just gotten the assignment. You're supposed to lead an army of green recruits. What's the first thing you would do? Train them, right? And I'm sure back in 1860, to get people to march together, drill together, it's just as challenging as what I hear some of our World War II veterans talk about, you know, straw foot, hay foot, right? People didn't know the difference between right and left sometimes. Well, it was the same way. Trouble is, as they're preparing, and where are they preparing these troops? Right outside Washington, D.C. It's the summertime. You ever been to Washington in the summertime? Hot, marshy, terrible place. And these troops, of course, they're itching for action, but the general doesn't feel they're ready for what? Combat. And he continues to drill them. Now remember, the clock is running. 90-day enlistments. After 90 days, they can what? Walk away. Well, it's not helping. Now on the other side of the coin, we have Robert E. Lee, who is not quite ready to be the leader of the Confederacy. He will come into play in 1862. But keep your mind focused on him because he has experience. He knows what it takes to run an army. He has trained soldiers. And what we're going to see repeatedly with the Confederacy in terms of their officers, they were teachers as well as military instructors. They knew what it took to get people ready. And that's going to be a big advantage here. Well, Lincoln is just, out of his tree. When are you ever going to move, McDowell? Come on. Well, I'm not ready, Mr. President. I'm not ready yet. Well, you've got to get ready because these guys are all going to go home. So he gets goaded into attacking the Confederates' Bull Run, Manassas, Virginia. In fact, the buzz has gone through the city that this is going to be like a picnic. People traveled out, because it's only 25 miles outside of Washington, in their little fringe surreys with their little horses, packing a picnic lunch. They're going to take up on the hilltops, and they're going to watch a glorious little war. and the Confederate Reb boys get wiped out, and that'll be the end of the war. Well, what happened? We all know the outcome. Hardly the case. Between General Johnston and this interesting, rather eclectic fella who was an instructor at VMI, General Thomas Jackson, there is a complete turnaround. In fact, don't think that General Stonewall Jackson was a great hero of the day. Johnston was so irritated with the guy. At one point, he gestures to his troops and he says, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." In other words, he wasn't doing a damn thing. Well, at the pivotal point in the battle, because he wasn't doing anything, and there was a necessity to overrun the Union artillery, and Johnson told his troops to fix bayonets and to run and charge and give a yell, boys, like the devils. And the Southern battle cry was born that day. Became kind of a symbol of the Confederacy, the fighting of the Confederacy. Well, good old Stonewall Jackson, he wasn't loved by his students. At one point, there was a contingent of alumni from VMI which attempted to get him removed. Problem was, he had a very unique style of teaching. He memorized his lectures and he recited them verbatim. He knew them right off the cuff. Boom, boom, boom. He just delivered them like a machine gun. Kid raises his hand, he would repeat the same lecture again. Well, if the kid didn't understand, he would do it again. And after a while, everybody thought that good old Stonewall Jackson was a little daft. He was a terrible teacher. He couldn't explain a damn thing to anybody. And he got all kinds of complaints. Of course, they probably didn't use teacher evaluations then, you know. You had the soapbox, you did what you wanted. But it was interesting because this man had a deep interest in his church. He was a Presbyterian Sunday school teacher. And he did something that was so unconventional that it even raised the eyes of those individuals who were of the Presbyterian faith. Back then, you didn't educate your African American slaves. In fact, African Americans were not encouraged to read and write. It was kind of a taboo. But Jackson believed that they ought to have the gospel, and he taught reading and writing, and he educated on Sundays his slaves in his church. So there's a dichotomy here. This God-fearing man who is going to stick up for the South, but he has a very different perspective. Well, this is the battle theater of 1861. Notice how many battles. 1, 2, 3, 4 battles. The biggest one, of course, is Bull Run. And that turned out to be a debacle. And of course, afterwards, McDowell was fired. Get rid of him. We have the rotation of 8 different leaders going on. Lincoln never finding the proper one to do it. Now, in the Western theater, much to the difference or the deference of the folks in the East, the outcome is much better. I entitled this slide, Scrounging for a Hero. Sometimes war is an outlet for others to be able to find their calling. And the person that finds his greatest calling is a rather embarrassed former military man who had attended West Point. And after the Mexican-American War, had gotten himself into a little problem. He ran into some troubles with a superior officer because he had an alcohol problem. Well, we shouldn't probably judge people by their drinking in the 1800s, because drinking was very commonplace, much more commonplace than it is today, more socially acceptable, etc. Except that this poor fella was drunk on the day that they handed out the pay. And back then, they didn't give you a check when you were in the Army. In fact, checks, those are like a 20th century invention. You got paid in cash. Well, if your paymaster is drunk, one could only imagine how the payments went out that day. Good old S. Grant was told to give it up. Resign. You're a disgrace. Well, the only thing he ever knew to do was to fight, right? He's an Army man. This is his training. This is his education, folks. He's a fighter. Well, let's be honest. You've been sacked because of drinking. Do you think that doesn't carry on in your life? Who's willing to take a chance on you? He's a family man. He has 2 kids at home. He's got a wife to take care of. And he's going to have to go home embarrassed. And he tries his hand at farming. Farming was probably like consulting is today. When you get unemployed, you know, everybody's a consultant. You ever notice that? You want to put that on your resume? You're a consultant. What are you consulting? I don't know. Maybe you watch TV all day. You consult. Well, farming was like the backup career. Everybody seemed to go farm, except that Grant was such a terrible farmer. Within 2 years, he pretty much bankrupted himself. Of course, who's bailing him out? His wife's family. It's embarrassing. Well, he has to find a new career. The next career he takes on is working in the tannery business. Well, he hated the sight of blood. And if you've ever been in a tannery, what do you have to remove off the cattle? Skins. It's not a clean operation. He's in Galena, Illinois, suffering immeasurably. And then the war breaks out. And as we know, there is local efforts to raise militias to go to the war. And he has been able to join a militia, the 21st Illinois Volunteer Militia. Well, he's got previous experience. And why not have this wonderful fella with previous experience? He could be a colonel, an officer. And, of course, he's got some political folks behind him. He suddenly rises within 3 months from a colonel to a general. But the problem always is what? If he sees a fifth of anything, he's going to be a hell of a general, huh? So, Mrs. Grant, in order to try and help him, wasn't uncommon back then that you had as a general a little aide-de-camp, you know, somebody that kind of straightened you up in the morning, made sure your uniform matched, your shoes were polished, your shaving equipment was there. Well, they sent the oldest son with explicit orders. If it smells like alcohol, looks like alcohol, keep it away. Well, as long as he was sober, he was a hell of a fighter. And Ulysses S. Grant will be the hero that emerges out west. And where he excels is in an early battle in 1861 at a place called Belmont, just south of Cairo, Illinois. Along the banks of the Mississippi, they have placed artillery, and they're ready to protect the Mississippi going from north to south from any incursions by any Union ships, gunboats or anything else. In an attempt to shake loose this emplacement, General Grant takes the initiative. And this is what I want to enforce upon you. You know, you're going to see generals, especially Union generals, when they want to, when left to making decisions by themselves, they're very hesitant. They don't want to make errors. So they err on the side of doing what? Nothing. Grant felt if there wasn't in the orders, that's just a reason to go forward and do something. Get it done. You know, always do it and then ask for forgiveness afterwards. You've heard that kind of thing before? Well, Grant was the classic student of that. Now remember that officers, especially on both sides, there was a heck of a lot of them out there that had very little, if no, military training. A lot of these jobs were political appointments. Well, the guy he fought against on the Confederate side was the law partner of President Polk. He had absolutely zero experience. With sighting in his artillery pieces, he had them too high, so they couldn't hit the water. So when Grant moves his troops across the Mississippi, the artillery is flying over their heads. And in a brave move, they displace General Pillow and they clear Belmont. Well, wow, a victory. Something that's been sorely lacking back in Washington. Lincoln sees on his desk, we won a battle. Who is this guy? Grant, Illinois. Oh, back from my neck of the woods. Let's keep an eye on this kid. Now, of course, in the wintertime, we see many times the hostilities are going to be very minimal, especially in 1861 and 1862. Armies don't travel well in snow, and they don't travel well in mud. And you're going to get both of those in ample quantities in the mountains and in the south with rains. The roads are not very passable. So usually from January to March, you see very little. But in 1862, in the spring, we're going to have an engagement, a battle, outside of Newport News, Virginia. The North has been developing a new weapon of mass destruction. That little mass destruction element is this wonderful boat called the Monitor. It defies all logic in terms of naval design. Notice how high the deck is. Any sort of activity in open seas with any sort of waves 3 or 4 feet high, that thing was awash most of the time. So they only could use it on very calm sea days. Well, the South had also been making their own weapon of mass destruction. They had retrofitted a boat, and they had fitted iron to it and put 19 different cannons on this boat, various sizes, whatever they could scrounge up. And they placed it on this boat, and they had a showdown. 2.5 hours, these boats wailed away on each other. Cannon shot after cannon shot. Well, normally, if you hit a boat with a wooden boat with a cannon ball, what's going to happen? It's going to splinter and cause damage. But the plate on these things, the cannonballs are what? Bouncing off. When they're wailing away 2.5 hours. The only reason why the battle stopped is the Merrimack ran out of what? Ammunition. They had to go back to get some more shells. What's significant about this is 2 things. We're seeing the development of metal boats, iron ships. Now, these are at their infancy, and we're going to see more of these ironclads develop over the course of the war. But who's going to have the advantage? Iron in construction? The North. And the North has far better sailors than the South. All throughout the war, the seas are pretty much mastered by the North. Now let's go again back to our Western theater, which is probably the only proud part of what's going on in 1862, at least in the spring, because General Grant and Admiral Foote are transversing down the Tennessee River, and their objective is these two forts, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. These forts were very well fortified. They were very strategic linchpins in the Confederacy's defense plan. Remember, the Confederacy is kind of like the football team in the fourth quarter that's sitting on a one-touchdown lead, but they're having a heck of a time getting a lot of momentum, and their hope is to do what? Run out the clock a little bit, right? Now, Grant is able to wrest away both of those forts. Now we all of a sudden see Kentucky is now out of the what? Picture. We've split it, and now we're going to split Tennessee. Notice the three largest cities in Tennessee at the time, significant cities: Memphis, Nashville, and then Chattanooga down in the corner, which is not on the map. Suddenly, you're working your way down, you're splitting the state. How are goods and services going to travel? Well, you're cutting these strategic rail lines, and you're also controlling the rivers. And that's going to be very important to keep in mind here. Now, got to move along. Well, in these battles, Grant finds a kindred spirit. Somebody who likes him, somebody he can trust, a former colleague. Well, this colleague has a lot of baggage. His name is William Tecumseh Sherman. Hell of a fighter, but the previous year he had suffered a nervous breakdown. He's politically well connected. He has a brother who's a congressman. He comes from a wealthy Ohio family. And because he has had the nervous breakdown, his wife makes appeal to his brother, who's the congressman. You know, this is running in your family. You need to do something about it. That's the gist of her letter to him. You know, in other words, this poor guy, yeah, I'm married to him. You need to do something for me because he's genetically one of yours. You know, and the word crazy or insane, they didn't have a notion, nervous breakdown. That doesn't mean, you know, permanent mental disorder. This poor guy is so leery. When he was put in command of his own units, he kept writing delirious letters back to the commanders saying that he needed more troops because there was just these huge Confederate armies out there. He was imagining things, paranoid, delusional. Sent him home to Ohio. Little rest. And he's put back into Missouri in a quartermaster's role. He actually outranks Grant. But look what he says. He's brought to this key battle at Fort Henry. He's supposed to be Grant's boss. And look what he says to him. I feel anxious about you as I know the great facilities the Confederates have, but I have faith in you. Command me in any way. Could you imagine your boss, your commander, saying, well, I'm throwing my whole efforts into your hands. Tell me what the hell to do. Well, Grant does. And this pair, we'll call them misfit toys, They get along well. And they're not really misfit toys. If they don't drink and they don't have paranoid delusional spells, they're going to be the toughest two commanders in the Union. And this will be noted at the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862, where they're going to run into our friend Beauregard and General Johnston. Well, the Confederates actually got the jump on Grant. They surprised the Union forces. They were making their breakfast, and they had attacked them. And they had chased Grant and his troops, but the fight was rather pitched. And during the fight, General Johnston was wounded in the leg, and he bled to death. General Beauregard decided to give it up after the first day, to rest his troops. Overnight, Generals Lew Wallace, you might know him because he wrote a book called Ben-Hur that was a famous movie done by who? Charleston Heston, right? We're contemporary. Arrived with a General Preston. They reinforced, and the next morning Grant counterattacked, and he pushed the Confederates right out of the state of Tennessee, right back into Mississippi. Now Grant has split. Go back here a second. He has split the whole state into two. Look at how far down he's gone now. This is the spring of 1862. Supplies that would have been counted on from the western part of the Confederacy are now being interrupted. That stuff that feeds the boys in the east, not coming through. Keep this in mind here as we go forward. Now, Shiloh is important because it was one of the costliest battles in the Civil War. On that day, the Union lost 20% of its force, and the South lost 25%. People are horrified. These battles are chewing up soldiers, chewing up men. How are we supposed to win? Do you think people are volunteering willingly now when they start hearing this kind of stuff? Well, what we'll see is eventually the position of a draft. At Shiloh, it was so intense. The bullets flew overhead. It sounded like a hornet's nest. Lead was flying everywhere. Now, down in the Mississippi, Gulf of Mexico and along the Mississippi Delta, the U.S. Navy has been actively moving. Admiral Daniel Farragut seizes not only the two forts at the very mouth of the Delta, Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, but he steams his way all the way up into New Orleans and takes New Orleans. Now the Mississippi is bottled up. We have the North forces moving from north to south, and now from south to north. The Mississippi, as an effective supply route, is becoming shortened, and the South will have difficulties. The next objective we're going to see is going to be the city of Vicksburg, and we'll talk about that as well. Now, shifting east again. Materials, goods, things that soldiers need are becoming shorter. The supply of these products for the Confederacy is becoming short. And the need for Confederate troops to plan battles and to be able to raid facilities is going to be very important. You're going to see, if you study the Civil War, that there's a number of battles that come out of Winchester, Virginia. It's a mountain city, town, and it's going to change hands 12 times during the war. The poor people didn't know if they were Confederates or Union, because every time somebody came in, they were equally as abused. But what's interesting about this place, it's a short distance away from Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry is a big depot where there's munitions, guns, food, etc. In September of 1862, Stonewall Jackson will raid Harper's Ferry. It's not because Harper's Ferry is a great strategic target. It's a great grocery store, great supply depot. In May of 1862, the Union alights on a plan. They believe if they can take Richmond, Virginia, the Confederacy is going to be dealt a deadly blow. We're scoring some success in the West. If we have some success in the East, we will be able to move along. General McClellan at this time, put in charge of the troops, he is ordered to take his troops as well as naval assets up the James River and head towards Richmond. And let me show you what happens here. You have two different forces moving up this peninsula with the ultimate objective being Richmond. The campaign, the Peninsula Campaign, is designed to pincher, squeeze General Lee, General Jackson, and James Longstreet in one movement. Let's get them. And they get very close to Richmond. But they're not able to get any closer than this because the South counterattacks, and during the 7-Day War, they call it, they're able to beat back the Union forces, pushing them back down the peninsula. In fact, the three generals I mentioned, Longstreet, Lee, and Jackson, are working so effectively as a team, they almost have a sense of mojo. They seem to have a good working relationship. They can anticipate each other. It's almost like they're able to presuppose what's going on. Now that's followed up with a second battle at Manassas, when the forces of General Pope, who is now put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, attempts to intercept Jackson. And in the zeal to try to get him, now Jackson has gone up to Manassas to steal supplies again. Remember, this is a common theme. The Confederates are always looking for groceries, and they're always looking for uniforms, and they're always looking for this stuff because they don't have enough of it. Remember, when you have thousands of people, things wear out, people are hungry, you're always constantly working on this notion of trying to get these people fed and taken care of. And Jackson is able to parlay Pope, and what we see is Longstreet comes to his aid, and they are able to knock them out. The Second Battle of Bull Run is another Confederate victory. So we saw the 7-Day Peninsula War, Confederate victory. Bull Run, Confederate victory. And then in the bloodiest single-day battle of the war, the Battle of Antietam, which occurs, we see Lee raid north to Maryland. Antietam is in Maryland, a border state. And this almost would make a beautiful movie. He had issued general orders. He had typed up or written up orders. Order 191 was distributed, indicating that he was going to split his forces into two groups, and he was going to lead this raid. One of his generals wrapped his cigars in the general orders. In the course of the battle, the cigars fell from his pocket. A private from Indiana found the general orders. Of course, this is the best intelligence yet, right? He runs back to General McClellan and says, look it, I got the battle plan. Prepare. And General McClellan starts to maneuver. He's going to capture, he's going to knock out Lee. Except that McClellan, big little Mac as they call him, moved like a snail. Snapping turtle. Yeah? Slow. By the time he reacts, what happens? Lee is moved. Here's the Battle of Antietam. Now we're going to see the Civil War is the first war that's actually captured on this new technology called a camera. Well, the first cameras, huge box cameras. The film is on glass plates. They're tedious. They're not going to be able to do those or shoot those pictures as battles are going on. So when do they take them? Afterwards. And sometimes the photographers weren't always honest. They stacked up bodies. They posed people that were dead in order to get effect. Because obviously if you want to sell the picture and you want your editor to run something, you better have something interesting, right? So they weren't entirely honest about it. Well, Lincoln has to do something. The North, there's disillusionment starting to happen. We just can't seem to beat Lee. We can't beat Jackson. We're having troubles with Longstreet. We just can't catch a break, can we? Well, why don't we issue a proclamation, an executive order called the Emancipation Proclamation, which will indicate to the Confederates that if we take over your state, we're going to free your slaves. Well, this was meant to put terror into the plantation class because remember, as we had indicated last week, most of them had heavily mortgaged their slaves, right? They had bought them on loans. If we happen to lose and the Union gets our people, they're going to set them free. What are we going to have? Nothing. Now notice how disingenuous this is, because this order only applies to slaves where? In Confederacy. The border states? Nah, that's okay. You can have those folks. And it was going to take place January 1st, 1863. He's hoping that there's going to be a ripple effect, that people are going to start sobering up in the South. Maybe we aren't going to continue it. It doesn't happen, does it? So we go into the end of the year. The Union, desperately looking for a victory, fights at Fredericksburg, Virginia. And from the get-go, it's a debacle. First of all, the Union troops are on the wrong side of the river. They've got to build bridges to get into Fredericksburg. Well, that's a city. The Southern troops have assembled themselves. They're shooting from the city. Urban combat. And they are able to buy enough time that Lee is able to put his troops on the heights outside of the city. So now the highest points are occupied by who will be able to shoot down and do whatever they need to do to keep the Union pinned down. The Union troops attempt to charge up the heights. Wave after wave, they're slaughtered. And the horror of this even horrifies Lee. It's easily the bloodiest and costliest battle. And of course, this is not going to be well received back in Washington, is it? Here's the idea. Burnside bringing the troops across through Fredericksburg up to Mary's Heights. What an ill-conceived plan. But what's interesting, who has the heights here? Lee. When he goes to Gettysburg, when we start talking about that next week, who will have the heights? The Union troops will. Why didn't he take a lesson from his own book? And that's going to be a question we'll have going forward. All right, we have just a few minutes, so let me see if I can catch us up on the way. There's our Confederate dream team. Everything's sailing along beautifully, right? There isn't a problem in the world. This trio, as long as they're together, they can pre-anticipate each other, they can fight, they're able to keep the Union at bay, at least in the East. The West, it's a different story. Maybe what will happen is there'll be enough dispirited people in the North. And we begin to see that there's a movement, a peace movement in the North. Mainly among immigrants and others who believe that this fight with the South is just wasteful. We're not making any progress. Copperheads, they call them. Just stop the war, let the South go, be done with them, damn it. Why waste any more troops? And Lincoln's popularity has sunk to new levels and new lows. Nobody believes that Lincoln is competent. He goes through generals at the top, left and right. Nobody, even inside the forces, believe he has the right idea. Well, that all changes, and it's funny, you kind of talk about a climactic moment. Well, that climactic moment is going to occur at Chancellorsville in April, late April, early May of 1863. It is Lee's finest moment, and it's the Confederacy's darkest period. Lee is able to surprise the Union forces, win the battle, but in the course of the battle, in the fog of war, his best general is hit. Jackson gets wounded. They have to take the general behind the lines. They operate on him. They amputate his arm. They expected that he might be able to recover. But of course, with amputations in the day, the problem is you're going to get secondary infections, and he caught pneumonia. 8 days later, he dies. That dream team is now broken. The pre-anticipation, the understanding that you know that a general that you serve with, you kind of understand what he's going to do in a situation, that's gone. We've got to find somebody to replace him. And that replacement is not going to be readily, not immediately. Lee is also becoming weary. The war has taken a toll on the Confederacy. And this is the battle at Antietam, where he splits his forces. Part of them are held up at Fredericksburg. The other folks take on the bulk of the Union troops at Chancellorsville. Well, Chancellorsville isn't even a town. It's somebody's country mansion. And with this fight, the South has won, but they're in terrible shape. The war is grinding on. The losses are mounting. Troops are getting harder to get. They need supplies. The blockade has been very effective. They're not getting things from Europe. They hope that they can score some sort of statement victory for two purposes. Maybe they can bring in England into the war, because England has been suffering. All that cotton that they would have had to create their textiles, it's not coming. They haven't sourced a new spot yet. Egypt hasn't come online yet. They need materials. Their industrial machine is at a standstill. And there's a hope that maybe if we could strike a blow at the North, a statement blow that maybe the social and political forces of the North would be such that they would want to stop the war. So what does Lee do? Well, before that, I got to talk about this young man. Good old Lincoln has another change of generals. He appoints General Joe Hooker as the leader of the Army of the Republic. Well, General Hooker was not necessarily the stern disciplinarian that one usually believed that a general should be. He had a fondness, a personal fondness for what we call fallen doves. That's how they were referred to back then. Ladies of the evening. Fallen doves. And in fact, his troops, the morale was so low that there was a portion of the Capital District in Washington that was pretty much known as Hookerstown, the red light district, because the best customers were Union troops who would slither out of camp and go down to pay a visit to the little ladies and pay them for their services, comfort services, obviously. And over time, his performance on the battlefield was just as shaky as everybody else. Now, to predicate this, Lee has kind of vanished off the radar screen after Antietam. He's gone behind the Shenandoah Mountains. He's running towards Pennsylvania. His ultimate goal is to make it to Harrisburg. Harrisburg, of course, is the state capital of Pennsylvania. If he can make a successful raid on Harrisburg, perhaps the Union would sober up and maybe sue for a negotiated peace. Now I will show you what will happen here before let me go there first, because we may run out of time here. The bulk of the forces are using the Shenandoah Mountains as cover, but we have General Stuart and his cavalry who is swinging around, and he's sighted all over the map. He's miles away. He's over in Maryland. Everybody thinks that he's stalking for Lee, right? Remember, the cavalry are supposed to be the eyes and ears. They're like the radar. So everybody's citing Stuart. The bulk of the Union Army is chasing who? A smaller force of Confederate cavalry. Misdirection play. Lee is making his way up towards Gettysburg. And we will talk next week why they discovered he's doing this. And remember, Gettysburg is not the objective. What is it? Harrisburg. But he never gets far enough up there. Some of his contingent Ewell gets almost to the door of Gettysburg, and they have to wheel back down because by this point they're engaging Union forces at the town of Gettysburg, and they have to come back. And this fight is going to be on the Union's terms. Remember this. Even though the Union at first is disorganized, this is going to be on their terms. Now, at the same time, out west, our friend General Grant is now moved out of Tennessee and is heading towards Vicksburg, Mississippi, one of the last Confederate citadels on the Mississippi. If you ever been to Vicksburg, or if you ever have the chance to go with us, you will be amazed at how high the city sits over the river and how much of a strategic advantage the Confederates have of the Mississippi River. Grant, in a series of battles, is able to surround Vicksburg. And he will lay siege to Vicksburg. At the same time, the heart of that battle is taking place on July 1st through July 3rd, the same time that the battle at Gettysburg is unfolding. On July 4th, Lincoln is going to be greeted with two wonderful presents. The Western Theater of the Confederacy will be sealed off along the Mississippi, and Gettysburg will yield the defeat of Lee. Okay? So we'll see that. Let me see if there's anything else. That's it. We're right up against 7:30. I think this is where we wanted to be. We're going to take our students downstairs. Kurt will remain up here to answer any questions